Okay, so on chapter 4, the chapter 3 on culture and chapter 4 on socialization are closely tied together in terms of their relationship. On the one hand, we have our culture, but then how does the individual actually learn or take on culture? And that's what socialization is all about. Culture is learned. So, what is the process by which we learn our culture? And that is socialization, to be socialized, to internalize, and to learn the norms. First of all, to learn the language of the culture, then to learn the norms, the values, and beliefs of the society in which we live. Um, so starting, I'm just going to go over some of these quickly, and then there's one section here I like to spend a little time because I think it's a little bit more challenging than some of these other concepts. But socialization, it says, is the process by which people develop a sense of self and learn the ways of the society in which they live. So let's think about socialization then is a process by which we develop a self, our internalized sense of identity, of me, our language use, through internalization of language, and then our interaction with significant others, we slowly but surely begin to develop a self-identity. We're not born with a self-identity. You know, you weren't born with your name, for example. Whatever your first name is, people call you by that name. Somebody gave you that name, for better or worse. You might not appreciate your name, but you weren't born with it. It wasn't innate. It came from the outside. Language, you weren't born with language. Language came from the outside. You were taught, both consciously and unconsciously, just listening. Our nonverbal communication as well, posture. And we can see this when you read this chapter. You on the next page there, actually on page 87, talking about the importance of social contact for human beings. Human beings infants it's a slow maturation process over, like other primates, over several years or more. Some families will kiddingly say, maybe getting a little too old and need to move out of the nest, but nonetheless, cases of extreme isolation is a good example. It talks about Isabel and Anna, two young girls who were found who were not socialized properly. And then when you see the results, they weren't able to speak language. They didn't even have proper physical ability to stand, and their posture was not correct. Highly emotional, excitable. So just read that section. It gives you, this is a classic in sociology. It shows the need for proper socialization to become a full functioning social human being. So without socialization, proper socialization, we would not develop a self-identity. Nor would we learn the ways of the society. Going back, think about we talked about culture and how, if a person is, if a human being is not able to learn culture, then we talk about that person as being a person without symbols. They don't have the ability to communicate socially. So socialization. Let me say another thing that's important about socialization. Another important aspect is that socialization, like some other areas that I talk about, uh, is not guaranteed. So there's a process of socialization, whether it takes effect, whether it works 80%, 90%, 50%. Generally, doesn't work 100%. Uh, so it's a process that, again, as we maturate, as we become full functioning selves, if you will, adults or young adults, uh, then we have that ability. Young children don't, but as we get older, we have that ability to say no. And so socialization does not guarantee that human beings will not deviate. Again, one of my favorite chapters, as you may guess, is on deviance when we talk about it. Because deviance is when we deviate from the norms of society, values, and beliefs. And that's what really, for me, makes us human after all. That gives us some of that freedom and distance from social structures and social determination, if you will. So that's another reason why we're not an exact science either. We can't predict 100%. If socialization worked 100%, then we would be a society of robots. Uh, the old notion of the yes man. We'd say yes to everything. Everything we were told to do, we'd just say yes. Of course, there's a high probability that we'll say yes in most circumstances, but we don't always do so. And so we're not robots. We're human beings. But without socialization and it working to a high degree, we would be in a human society would not be possible. Civilization would not be possible. Because we have to learn how to interact with others through language using symbols. And we have to learn what's the proper ways of behaving. That is the norms. And we have to learn the values and the beliefs. And when we do that, we feel comfortable with each other because we're from the same cultural background. We speak the same language. And we know how to behave in certain situations with each other. And without that, we would be there would be chaos for the most part because we're no longer instinctual animals either. So. Or even saying that, even the instincts that maybe we do have, they're curbed by culture. That is, things such as aggressive behavior, violence. It's controlled to a great extent through socialization, the do's and don'ts of the things that's proper to do in the culture and what's not proper. The next concept is internalization, and internalization is the process in which people take as their own, accept as binding the norms, values, beliefs, and language that their socializers are attempting to pass on. So internalization is the internalizing of society's, first of all, language, then internalizing norms, values, and beliefs, and accepting as, when we talk about internalization, and to internalize something, we accept it as our own. So what maybe began from the outside, when we internalize it, and most children have to, for the most part, internalize what they're being taught because they haven't developed a self-reflection. To be able to resist the message, right? So the parents or the significant others are like an overlord in some sense to the young child, a God figure. What they say is sacrosanct. It's the truth, and so young children don't really have the ability to be critically analyzing what they're being taught. So internalization is important in childhood, and that's why we have so much worry and psychologist concerns about how children are raised, such as consistent behavior towards your children so they don't internalize a conflictive self or an inferiority complex, this kind of thing. So internalization is an important process of internalizing and then taking I'll give you an example that's coming up here briefly when we talk about total institutions, but we internalize especially at the what we call secondary socialization. Primary socialization is the socialization that takes place with young children up to about 12 years old. Secondary socialization is for we adults from middle teenage years all the way through the rest of our lives. We go through a lot of secondary. Secondary is socialization because now that we have the facilities to think on our own, we can more or less say no to things. So, for example, when a political party is after your vote and they've got a certain message, and a lot of times they say things that people want to hear anyway. But let's say they're talking about their format, their political format, and you decide, hey, these guys are for me, this party. They're saying the things that really ring a bell with me. I'm going to become a member of that party. And what you're really seeing is I'm internalizing their message. I'm internalizing that and accepting it as binding. It is my own perspective now. You can just sit with yourself a while and talk about, your attitudes, your political beliefs, your religious beliefs, your outlooks, and then you can think about, are they really original to you, or where did you get these from? Think about where they came from. And 9 times out of 10, you've internalized and accepted as binding to yourself internally that these ideas, these perspectives are your perspectives. When you accept it as that, I believe that too. Hey, I like that idea. I believe that myself. I'm going to go with that. Yeah. And then when you go out to communicate with others, you might express, well, that's my attitude or that's my perspective on that situation. At that point, you've internalized some ideas or perspectives or values that started from somewhere else out there in society and culture, and you've internalized it. So internalization is also a process of of being bonded to some message or some way of life that you personalize it, right? And if you look around, you'll find that there's many, many, many others that probably have the very same values, outlooks that you do. Even things such as clothing styles and musical styles. Our culture is always trying to talk to us as if we're very individualized. Even our advertisements do that. Hey, wear this and you'll be much seen as an individualist, nonconformist, and blah blah. Just like in the '60s when we had our long hair and bell-bottom jeans and peace symbols. Hey, maybe we differentiated ourselves that way from the older generation, but we were conformists nonetheless because all the other young people were wearing their hair the same way, wearing the same clothes, listening to the same records. As I said at the beginning of the class, that we tend to be highly conformist in many ways. Just all you gotta do is sit down and think about it a little bit. But the next two concepts, nature and nurture, there's been an ongoing debate in the social sciences about. Nature stands for your genetic background, your brain size, for example, your genetic makeup. Nurture is the environment, the social environment in which you live. So we can think of nurture as socialization into culture. Nurture implies that we're cultural creatures and we learn to be human through socialization. Nature says that human is those who fall more on the nature side, what we call biological determinists, take the point that most human behavior is genetically determined. Whereas on the other extreme, my side of the story would be more on the socialization side, that really we're more products of socialization. Children, and it is very easy I think it's more easier to test the socialization side more than the nature side. Yes, everybody can have the same propensities, but whether one is going to be aggressive or passive, have certain values, certain outlooks, is through process of socialization from others. And if you live in a culture that requires that aggressiveness on the part of males needs to remain dormant, it's not valued, then not always, again, not 100%, but most of the males in that culture will tend to be more docile, more laid back, if you will. Do not display aggressive behavior. If you live in a society like ours, that all you got to do is watch TV a couple of nights to see that violence is something that is perpetuated in our culture. Aggressive males, aggression on the part of males, while it's not always said openly, is all you got to do is sociologically be mindful of the culture you live in. You can see that it is rewarded highly. It is expected. If a male doesn't show a competitive, aggressive style of self, then a lot of times they're called names or not rewarded for that, for not being so. And in other cultures, the aggressiveness is not rewarded. So socialization plays a main role in our attitudes and our behaviors. We know this from myriad of studies. But there's not a stalemate now, but there's more of the nature nurture debate, we call it, has come to a compromise. And now we as sociologists, we do recognize, and as genetic studies have become more and more sophisticated, that human behavior at a genetic level is important. It does play a part in people's behavior. It's not something that's totally missing in terms of a link to explaining human behavior. Now we say they both come together. Nature, the way I like to say it is that the nature side sets up the potential, gives us the potential to learn culture. Human beings all share certain characteristics that we all can display. Passive behavior, aggressive behavior. It's how we're socialized that will have an impact on how we express ourselves and what lays dormant within us. But nature sets up the potential genetically. For example, our brain size, correct brain functioning, so that, for example, if you weren't able to memorize, have a memory, then you would not be able to learn culture, because a lot of cultural knowledge is based on our memory ability, the biological functioning capacity to memorize, right? And so I like to say that nature sets up the potential to learn culture. And once we have that, normal brain capacity and everything's working well, then culture takes over. Uh, some folks that have brain damage or other abnormalities in terms of their ability to speak and to learn language, that limits that person to be fully socialized. And so they may have to be institutionalized or at least help through their lives and managing their lives. We talk about people without symbols. Excuse me. So nature nurture debate's interesting, but we've come to a compromise. Both are important for the fully functioning, fully socialized human being. And read about the cases of extreme isolation. Okay. Then I'm going over here. Now on page 91, they talk about individual and collective memory. So individual memory may be your own individual memory of your life, your biography. But also parts of our memory is caught up in what we call collective memory. And collective memory is the experiences shared and recalled by significant numbers of people. Such memories are revived, preserved, shared, passed on, and recast in many forms such as stories, holidays, rituals, and monuments. Collective memory. So some of what's passed down to us in terms of socialization is, for example, your national history, collective events that mark a country's, a nation state's history, whether good for good or bad. But we learn these not so much. Well, certainly we learn it through books as well, but we also learn it through the oral histories of being raised in our families, being around your grandparents, other folks, that you're around as a kid, and you hear them telling stories about things that happened in the past, and that's passed on. It's passed on to the next generation, maybe modified, but. For example, for the younger generation, 9/11, of course it is for us older folks too, but 9/11 would be is burned into the collective memory of the people of the United States. And that's something that will be talked about for generations to come. World War II, many of us have an interest in World War II and the so-called greatest generation. And, you can see the monuments. For example, go to Washington, D.C., you have the United States Marine monument, beautiful monument of the flag raising at Iwo Jima, an actual historical event. We hear the veterans, maybe some vets in your own family or friends, fathers who fought in World War II, and that they tell stories of battles and what they endured. We read about it. So especially for that generation, but even for later generations, that information has been passed down to us. And we reinvest in the past. We reinvent the past through storytelling. And so collective memory is a really important concept to look at. Where were you when Kennedy was assassinated? A lot of you weren't even born. If you were like me, you were, old enough, it's third grade, you know exactly where you were when you found out about that. And the same thing with Martin Luther King and Kennedy's brother as well, Senator Kennedy. So these events, the Vietnam War was a very traumatic decade in the '60s. For my generation, it had a great impact on all of us. We may have different views on things, but you can't say that it didn't have an impact on our generation, the baby boomers. And then for the new generation, you have your markers. You'll be talking about your past to your children and your grandchildren about the good old days, right? When rap music was popular. You know, your hairstyles and your clothing styles, and all that'll be changed within the next 20 or 30 years for sure. Uh, but let's go over the main part I want to talk to you in this chapter and spend some time is when we get to the mid stages of self-development, role taking, and then the 3 stages of self-development. Significant symbols. And he talks in here about meaningful social interaction depends on the involved parties sharing significant symbols. What they're talking about here is the use of language to communicate. That can be verbal language, orally, or it could be written language, but it can also be symbolic messages can be sent non-verbally. Through our posture, through our eye contact, how we dress, right? Can send a message. Communicates. It may not always be in the intended communication, but we're symbolic creatures, and we're always reading it. Out there in everyday life, how people speak to us, how people approach us. What did he mean? What did she mean by that? Blah blah. That look, that attitude. We're always reading each other and trying to symbolically. When we interact with each other, we have to take each other into consideration, and that's called role taking on page 94. But I'm going to go through this just sort of slowly, just a little bit, just make sure that you understand these abstract concepts. Really, it's just about how the self goes through a process of socialization and learning one's culture. So it says, first of all, we have to learn language, we have to learn gestures that are meaningful and that can be shared from one person to the next. It says symbolic gestures and nonverbal cues such as the tone of voice and body movements that convey meaning from one person to another. I would like to stress that meaning may not be accurate. It might be a misperception, but it's meaning nonetheless. So when the teacher talks a little maybe harsher to you, you may feel like you're being spoke at instead of to you. It may be taken wrong that the professor's angry with you or non-concerned. Just so many situations. You thought some person's angry with you because maybe they didn't say hello to you this morning. Maybe they had something on their mind. But you may have taken it as a lot of times when that happens, it's called breaking a folkway, right? When the person doesn't say hello back to you in the morning, oh, I'm fine, how are you doing this morning? They just don't speak. You think in your mind, what did I do, right? Why are they upset at me? And they may not be upset at you. But still, that meaning is being conveyed just from that nonverbal of not speaking back because that person's breaking a folkway. And when that happens to us, we become anxious. So language is central in our ability to role take. I'm already over on page 94. Role taking. People acquire a sense of self when they can role take. Role taking is the process of stepping outside the self and imagining how others view its appearance and behavior from an outsider's perspective. The process of stepping outside of ourselves and imagining how others view our appearance and behavior from an outsider's perspective. That's self-consciousness. How are people going to view me? And so we're self-conscious of that, of how we appear to others. And in that role taking, then we develop a kind of empathy for other positions, other people's position with us in social interaction. Um, if we didn't do that, if we didn't care, if we didn't give a hoot about how we appear to others, and there's some people that kind of approach that reality in some ways, and a lot of times they're defined as deviant, and they may not be able to get along with people, and may not be able to socially interact with people for very long without getting in a lot of trouble because they're not role taking. That is, they're not putting themselves in other people's shoes and gaining empathy and wanting to look your best to get, you're thinking about how people are looking at you and you're concerned about it, how they perceive you. So you'll try to conform your behavior to social expectations. And, so role taking is a very important process in the development of the self from a sociological standpoint. Stepping out of our selfish perspective. Young children stepping outside of their selfish perspective and putting themselves in mother's shoes or dad's shoes or some other significant other in their environment. And then making themselves an object. How do I look when I play mother with, let's say, the little girl, she's playing with her doll, and all of a sudden now she's the mother, like her mother, and she acts towards the doll the way the mother acts towards her. So she's role taking. She's learning something about being a mother from her mother. In our culture, some of the ways in which mothering is done, and she's practicing that role taking with the baby doll. Then later on in life, that becomes a little more complicated, as we'll see. But role taking is central to be socialized into developing into ability to develop into a full functioning social self. We call it that self that's able to go anywhere and interact with others pretty much on a normal basis. But on page 94, George Herbert Mead was he's kind of coined as being one of the fathers of symbolic interactionist theory, and this is coming out of symbolic interactionism, which is concerned with meaning making and socialization. But Mead, he really kind of gives us sociology's take on self-development. There's quite a few theories in psychology that that's going to make contributions to self-development. This is sociology's contribution, if you will, our answer. And so we're going to start. I'm going to go ahead and start another section. We're going to deal with this final piece here on the self-development through Mead's 3 stages of self-development. So let me start another one real quick.